Hell Beach, Sri Lanka. Many thousands of Tamil civilians were killed here as the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam made their last stand against advancing government forces. Just how many, though, is what everyone's grappling with. In the fog of war, this area was an information black hole. Independent journalists and observers kept out. It was, as they say, a war without witnesses. The world's eyes and ears, Tamil doctors working in mobile field hospitals as artillery shells rained down. Citing confidential UN documents, the Times newspaper today claimed that more than 20,000 civilians may have been killed in what the government had designated a no-fire zone in the final days of the conflict, at the rate of 1,000 a day. The Sri Lankan government swiftly shot down this claim as baseless. Even the UN said the numbers were impossible to verify.
At the moment, it's really hard to know what were the level of civilian casualties over the last weeks, especially in the last few weeks of the war, when it's very difficult to get clear information.
But Channel 4 News has spoken to relief agencies, human rights groups and other independent observers who were forensically monitoring this conflict. Some had workers in the heart of the conflict zone right up until the final bloody push. They've told us that although hard to corroborate, the maths isn't that far out, and here's why. By the beginning of May, as government troops closed in, tens of thousands of civilians managed to flee the shrinking conflict zone, but tens of thousands of others were trapped. The Sri Lankan government claimed 40,000 civilians remained. Relief agencies we spoke to, with people still inside the zone, put the number at 100,000. This roughly accords with UN estimates from satellite imagery, based on the number of tents and the estimated number of occupants. Thousands more fled on the 16th of May as the last battle loomed. The government claimed all the civilians were out. But an agency worker who joined the exodus phoned his headquarters as he fled. "I'm crossing the lagoon now," he said. "I'm leaving with many civilians, but there are a lot left. The Tamil Tigers are keeping them." The question is, how many were still stranded? To figure that out, you work backwards. Of the 289,000 now in camps, the UN says 88,000 arrived after the Tigers' defeat. But we know that 100,000 were inside, so that leaves 12,000 people missing, presumed dead. Add that to more than 7,000 civilians the UN says were recorded killed in the first 4 months of this year, and you're at more than 19,000 civilians. This estimate then for the period since January, with around 2/3 of the civilian deaths in the final few days. So, 20,000 in total? Yes. Very feasible, said our sources in Sri Lanka. Very plausible, very credible.
There's always been a discrepancy between what the government claimed, the number of people who had fled the conflict area, and the number of the people that the UN claimed was still in the conflict area. So there was a question mark as to how many people still remained when the government closed this access by the ICRC. And the 20,000 to 25,000 figure is not surprising at all, given the daily casualties.
The UN Secretary-General visited the camps for displaced civilians, the survivors, last weekend, complimenting the government on its humanitarian role. Since then, the UN Human Rights Council's passed a resolution praising the Sri Lankan government for its defeat of the Tamil Tigers. This was a blow to Western calls for an investigation into possible war crimes by both sides. A spokesman for the separate United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights told us today they weren't happy. There should be an inquiry into what went on, he said. We know something bad happened, and we need to know more.
Whether you are intentionally or unintentionally telling us the truth, because you won't allow independent witnesses.
We want to protect the safe.
Well, can you explain to us, if you wish to protect them, why your forces have been shelling a hospital?
I want to make this point very clear, that Sri Lankan government never attacks, it only retaliates. Because this...
Nonetheless, you have been firing into a hospital, correct?
No, that's not true. That's
Whether
not
by
true.
mistake or not. Well,
No.
of course, we've no way of independently verifying it, because you won't let journalists in to see.
Right.
But we take it from reports You heard a spokesman there for the International Committee of the Red Cross talking about precisely what was happening there.
High Commissioner, your government has decided the New York Times, the BBC, Channel 4 News, all these people are unfit to report your conflict. Yet you're saying you have the good news, of winning this military battle against these Tamil extremists, and you won't let them in there. Who are you to judge who's good and bad?
Civilians have been killed. Some 52 civilians so far have been killed. Human Rights Watch is accusing the Sri Lankan government, your government, of, quote, callous indifference towards the 250,000 civilians who were caught in this 115 square mile area. What are you doing to protect them?
Rather an emotional statement that you just made. For one thing, we do not believe that there are 250,000 civilians caught in there. Nobody's ever counted them. There are figures being bandied around in the public arena with no substantiation at all. We don't think there are many people in the two districts which were formerly occupied by the Tamil Tigers. And that's one.
The reality is civilians are being caught. And the fact of the matter is we're not getting a clear picture out of what is happening because you're not allowing independent journalists to go in and cover this very important situation. Why are you banning reporters from going in there?
How desperate has the situation become for those civilians there?
Well, it's becoming more and more desperate, and certainly there is mounting international concern about the plight of these civilians. At the moment, the aid agencies estimate there are 250,000 people trapped. Now, that figure is very much disputed by the Sri Lankan government, who say it's been grossly exaggerated. They believe the figure is half of that, about 120,000 civilians. Even so, whatever the correct figure is, it's a lot of civilians we're talking about.
What, if anything, at the moment, then, Alex, are the aid agencies able to do in terms of helping the people that are trapped?
There's very little that they can do. They themselves are not allowed into the area. They've got a number of their vehicles stranded.
Heavy artillery or air power in their self-designated no-fire zone, where tens of thousands of civilians and the last remaining rebels had clustered. But now that appears to have changed as a result of these United Nations satellite images. UNOSAT says these pictures show craters which were formed inside the zone between the 15th of March and the 19th of April, the day before the army breached earthen defences and civilians started to pour out. A senior UNOSAT official says the accuracy involved would have required air power. Now, a senior foreign ministry official tells Al Jazeera that the government has indeed bombed its self-declared no-fire zone from the air. That's a very different line from the one that was being maintained at the time UNOSAT says the bombing craters were being made.
The categorical position has always been that this is a no-fire zone that we have declared, and we will not fire to that no-fire zone.
There is no shelling. We demarcated this safe zone for the safety of the civilians. There is no shelling taking place in that area.
The Sri Lankan government says these images from pro-Tamil sources, reportedly showing a recent aerial bombardment, are spliced together and misleading.
Are there a large number of rebels in this area?
The number is small. We believe that there are about 200 rebels trapped in this area.
Some of them denying the shelling, although just a few hours ago you said that the government had retaliated to the Tamil Tigers and taken them out using proportionate force. So there has been firepower in the safe zone.
I asked you the same question. Do we know exactly when these shell holes were created? What created these shell holes? How big are they? I think it's important to determine all this. The government will determine this, not for any other reason, but to disprove the claim that the government had actually been responsible for most of these shell holes.
Dr. Cohen, I'm glad you've taken a look at those UN satellite pictures. Now, the head of the Rapid Mapping Unit has told us that the craters were caused by airstrikes, most likely. The dates were between the 15th of March, with the latest crater on the 19th of April, and the satellite technology used to accurately pinpoint date and location. So, as far as the UN is concerned, there has been shelling in that area, and the government, who's made many conflicting reports, just keeps denying this.